The Boston air carried a crisp autumn chill as Susan Lambert stared at her phone, David's name flashing across the screen. Her 64-year-old fingers hesitated before answering. When was the last time her son had actually called instead of sending those perfunctory text messages that had become their relationship? 3 months. Susan's apartment, modest but impeccably maintained, reflected a life of careful choices. Photographs lined the mantel, mostly of Emily, her 4-year-old granddaughter with dark curls and a smile that could light up the darkest corners of Susan's heart. The cream-colored walls and simple furnishings spoke of comfort rather than luxury, though few would guess that the woman who lived here could afford far more. The phone continued to ring, almost accusatory in its persistence. Susan smoothed her silver hair, squared her shoulders, and answered with a warmth her son hadn't earned. David's voice carried an uncharacteristic cheerfulness. "We've been thinking, Mom. Victoria and I want to invite you to dinner at Bellevue this Friday, to reconnect. We feel like we've been distant lately." Susan's heart leapt before caution could temper her hope. Bellevue, the crown jewel of her carefully concealed empire, the restaurant where Boston's elite gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to see and be seen, where the waitstaff knew her as Mrs. Lambert, the owner, though her own son remained oblivious to this fact. The irony wasn't lost on her. Would Emily be there? Susan's voice betrayed her eagerness, her longing for the granddaughter she watched twice weekly while David and Victoria attended their social functions and charity events. "No, just adults. Victoria's parents will join us." David's tone shifted subtly. "It's important, Mom. We need to discuss some things." After hanging up, Susan walked to her bedroom window overlooking the city. Below, Boston continued its evening rhythm, unaware of the small earthquake that had just rumbled through her world. A dinner invitation shouldn't feel momentous yet. Something in David's voice, a carefully measured cadence, triggered an uneasiness she couldn't ignore. The reflection in the window glass showed a woman still beautiful in her 7th decade with intelligent eyes that had witnessed enough of life to recognize warning signs. Yet those same eyes still sparkled with hope whenever David reached out, however infrequently. Susan turned from the window toward her closet where her modest wardrobe hung in perfect order. Among the practical pieces stood one pearl gray dress, simple but elegant, saved for special occasions. She touched the fabric, remembering the last time she'd worn it Emily's 4th birthday party 3 months ago. Victoria had barely acknowledged her presence, steering the other guests, mostly Victoria's friends and their impeccably dressed children, away from Susan, as if poverty might be contagious. The memory of Emily running to her small arms, wrapped around Susan's legs, chocolate cake smeared on her cheek, provided a momentary balm. "Grandma Susan, I saved you cake." The other children already took all the frosting flowers. "But I saved you a special piece." Victoria had appeared instantly, whisking Emily away with a tight smile. "Emily, darling, Mrs. Johnson wants to see your new dollhouse. Susan, there's coffee in the kitchen if you'd like some." Mrs. Johnson. Not Mom or mother-in-law. Always Susan, as though no family ties existed between them. 30 years earlier, Susan Lambert had been Susan Mitchell, a young woman suddenly abandoned with a 5-year-old son when her husband decided family life was too constraining. The small apartment they'd shared had seemed cavernous after James left, filled with the echo of David's questions. "When is Daddy coming home? Why did he leave? Is it because I was bad?" Each question had pierced Susan's heart, but she never allowed David to see her pain. Instead, she'd taken on additional work, cleaning houses in the morning, waiting tables during lunch, cooking in a restaurant kitchen at night. Sleep became a luxury, but David never went hungry, never wore secondhand clothes if she could help it, never missed a school field trip because the fee couldn't be paid. Those early years taught Susan the value of observation. In the homes she cleaned, she noted how the wealthy managed their finances, overheard investment strategies while dusting office bookshelves. In restaurants, she learned the business from the ground up: food costs, labor management, customer psychology. Knowledge accumulated like compound interest stored away for future use. When David entered middle school, Susan secured a position managing a small cafe. 2 years later, she became the assistant manager at a popular downtown restaurant. By the time David started high school, she had saved enough to open a small breakfast place of her own. The location wasn't ideal, but her food was exceptional, and word spread quickly. David, absorbed in adolescence, hardly noticed his mother's gradual transformation from struggling single parent to successful business owner. When he was accepted to Boston University, his tuition fully funded by Susan's carefully hidden savings, he assumed student loans and scholarships had made it possible. Susan never corrected this assumption, wanting her son to develop his own work ethic rather than relying on her success. Through David's college years, Susan expanded her restaurant holdings, selling the breakfast place at a substantial profit and opening 2 more upscale establishments. When the opportunity arose to purchase Bellevue, an iconic but failing restaurant in Boston's financial district, she leveraged everything she had built to acquire it. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Under Susan's guidance, Bellevue became the destination for Boston's power brokers, politicians, and social elite. Yet she maintained her modest lifestyle, living in the same comfortable but unassuming apartment, driving a reliable but unremarkable car, and watching her wealth grow from a distance like tending a garden she rarely entered. Why maintain the charade? The question had haunted her for years. Perhaps it began as a test. Would David recognize his mother's accomplishments without being told? Would he value her for her mind, her determination, her business acumen, or would he, like so many others, only see an aging woman whose worth was measured by the designer label on her clothes? When David met Victoria Thompson during his final year of law school, the answer began to crystallize. Victoria came from the world Susan had learned to navigate, but never embraced old money, social connections, carefully cultivated appearances. The Thompson family name opened doors that talent alone kept firmly closed. At first, Victoria had been coolly polite to Susan, treating her with the distant courtesy one might show to service staff. After the engagement, even that minimal warmth evaporated. Susan became an inconvenient reminder of David's less polished origins, a blemish on the narrative Victoria was crafting for their shared future. David, eager to be accepted into Victoria's world, began to pull away from his mother. The changes were subtle at first: canceled dinner plans, shortened phone calls, conversations that skimmed the surface of their lives. After the wedding, the distance widened into a chasm Susan didn't know how to cross. Emily's birth briefly bridged the gap. Victoria, overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood and unwilling to sacrifice her social calendar, reluctantly accepted Susan's offer to help. Twice weekly, Susan cared for her granddaughter, treasuring those hours of storytelling, baking cookies, and watching Emily's personality unfold like a miraculous flower. Those precious afternoons sustained Susan through the growing coldness from her son and daughter-in-law. She could endure Victoria's dismissive tone and David's embarrassed silence when she arrived at their elegant townhouse in her modest clothes, driving her practical car. Emily's delight at seeing her was worth any humiliation. Now preparing for this dinner at Bellevue, Susan sensed a shift in the atmospheric pressure surrounding her relationship with her son's family. Victoria's parents joining them suggested a coordinated effort, a united front. The things David needed to discuss carried ominous undertones. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth. Susan dressed with care, applying light makeup and securing her silver hair in a simple but elegant style. The pearl gray dress still fit perfectly, complemented by a single strand of pearls, real ones, though not ostentatious, that had been her mother's. Simple pearl earrings completed the ensemble. As she stepped from her car at the restaurant, Susan observed her reflection in Bellevue's gleaming windows. She looked dignified, appropriate for an upscale dinner. Not fashionable by Victoria's standards, perhaps, but certainly not the embarrassment her daughter-in-law made her feel. The maitre d' greeted her with professional courtesy, showing no sign that he recognized her as the owner. Susan had instructed her staff years ago to treat her like any other guest when she dined with family or friends, maintaining her carefully constructed separation between her business and personal lives. "The Thompson party is already seated, madam. Right this way." Susan followed him through the dining room, past tables of Boston's elite, enjoying the impeccable cuisine and attentive service that had made Bellevue famous. Mayor Harrington nodded to her from his regular corner table, and Judge Kimball raised her wine glass in silent greeting. Susan acknowledged them with the slightest smile, not wanting to draw attention as she approached her son's table. The 4 of them were already seated: David, Victoria, and Victoria's parents, Richard and Eleanor Thompson. The table was clearly set for 5, with Susan's place in the corner, partially hidden by an ornamental plant. The seating arrangement spoke volumes about her anticipated role in the evening's proceedings. They greeted her with air kisses that never made contact with her skin. Victoria's expensive perfume, Clive Christian, if Susan wasn't mistaken, at over $500 an ounce, created an almost visible barrier between them. Eleanor Thompson's diamonds caught the light, throwing miniature rainbows across the white tablecloth. "You're late, Susan." Victoria glanced pointedly at her gold watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than most people earned in a month. Victoria never called her mom or mother, always Susan, as if denying the family connection through sheer linguistic stubbornness. The traffic was terrible. Susan took her seat in the corner position, feeling herself being tucked away out of sight. David barely met her eyes, his attention focused on the wine list as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Richard Thompson, a heavy-set man with a carefully trimmed silver mustache and the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed both good scotch and the sound of his own voice, dominated the conversation immediately. The market is absolutely bullish right now. My portfolio manager says we're looking at a 15% return this quarter alone. Eleanor nodded in practiced admiration of her husband's financial acumen, her helmet of blonde hair certainly colored at her age, not moving a millimeter. Victoria listened with the attentiveness of a student before a revered teacher, while David contributed occasional affirmative noises to demonstrate his engagement. Susan observed the performance with anthropological interest. The Thompson family dynamic operated on clearly established hierarchies, with Richard at the apex, and everyone else orbiting his gravitational pull. David had been absorbed into this system, accepting his subordinate role in exchange for the benefits of association. The waiter approached with menus bound in soft black leather, presenting them with a slight bow. Susan recognized him as James, one of her longest-serving staff members, though his professional demeanor gave no hint of familiarity. Victoria didn't bother opening her menu. She snapped her fingers, actually snapped them like summoning a servant in a period drama, and announced 5 lobster thermidors, the large ones, and a bottle of your best white wine. David cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward Susan. 4 lobsters, he corrected gently. Victoria followed his gaze to Susan, confusion briefly clouding her perfect features before understanding dawned. A smile spread across her face, not a warm smile of inclusion, but the predatory grin of someone who has just spotted an opportunity for cruelty disguised as practicality. Oh, right, 4 lobsters. Victoria turned to James and added, raising her voice just enough to maintain the facade of casual conversation while ensuring everyone at neighboring tables could hear, "We don't provide extra food. Just water for her." James blinked, his professional mask slipping momentarily as he registered the deliberate humiliation being inflicted. He looked at Susan, clearly expecting her to contradict this arrangement or to order something for herself. Before Susan could respond, David interjected, "It's just that Mom already ate before she came, right?" His tone carried a clear warning, a command dressed as a question. Susan felt something break inside her chest. Not dramatically, not with the theatricality of a heart literally shattering, but with the quiet devastation of a final hope being extinguished. Her son, the boy she had sacrificed everything for, was not just allowing this treatment, but actively participating in it. "Of course, just water is fine." Susan's voice emerged steady, betraying none of the earthquake rumbling through her soul. Victoria smiled in satisfaction, leaning back in her chair like a cat that had successfully cornered its prey. James nodded and retreated quickly, probably relieved to escape the table's toxic atmosphere. Richard and Eleanor Thompson seemed oblivious to the exchange, or more likely considered it too insignificant to acknowledge. They continued discussing their recent Mediterranean cruise, detailing the exclusive ports and private tours that had made their experience superior to that of ordinary travelers, and the chef's table on the ship simply extraordinary. Eleanor's voice carried that particular cadence of the privileged sharing experiences they assumed everyone found impressive. 7 courses every night, each paired with the perfect wine. "I gained 5 pounds. She patted her rail-thin frame with a laugh that suggested gaining weight was a charming indulgence, rather than a genuine concern. Susan sat with her hands folded in her lap, the epitome of composed dignity. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than protest observation, more revealing than confrontation. Each word spoken at the table, each gesture and expression she catalogued mentally, building a case file of evidence against these people who believed themselves untouchable in their social fortress. The lobsters arrived 10 minutes later on elegant white plates, the shells gleaming red against the porcelain melted butter, glistening in small silver cups alongside. James placed them carefully before each of the other 4 diners, his movements precise and controlled. He filled their wine glasses with a pale gold Montrachet that Susan knew cost $300 a bottle. Before her, the empty space on the table emphasized her exclusion. Only a crystal glass of water sat in front of Susan Condensation, forming a small puddle around its base. Victoria attacked her lobster with surprising enthusiasm for someone so concerned with appearances. She extracted a generous piece of white meat, bathed it in butter, and brought it to her mouth with deliberate slowness, closing her eyes in theatrical appreciation. Exquisite. She dabbed the corners of her mouth with her napkin. Absolutely exquisite. This place never disappoints. Definitely the best restaurant in the city. Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. So exclusive, so refined. David began eating as well, though Susan noticed he avoided looking directly at her. He focused intently on breaking apart his lobster, as if the task required his complete concentration. His cowardice was perhaps more painful than Victoria's overt cruelty. At least she was honest in her disdain. Susan remained motionless, hands still in her lap. Her water glass sat untouched. The thirst she felt couldn't be quenched by water, nor by wine or any earthly beverage. It was a thirst for respect, for acknowledgement, for the basic human dignity these people seemed determined to deny her. Richard Thompson, having demolished half his lobster with efficient precision, finally addressed Susan directly. "Michael, your mother is very quiet. Has she always been like this?" He spoke about Susan as if she weren't present, as if she were a curiosity to be discussed rather than a person participating in the conversation. His tone carried the clinical interest of a scientist observing a specimen under glass. "Mom has always been simple, humble." David swallowed his bite before answering. "You know she comes from a different generation." "Humble." Victoria repeated the word with subtle venom as if it were synonymous with deficient or pathetic. "Yes, definitely humble." Susan wanted to object, to clarify that humble didn't mean invisible, that simple wasn't interchangeable with stupid. The words formed in her mind sharp and clear, but she held them back. Something instinctive told her to wait, to observe, to let them continue revealing themselves through their casual cruelty. Eleanor poured herself more wine, the bottle already half empty. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she raised her glass. "These must be such difficult times for people your age, Susan. With no stable income, not enough savings. It's a shame the older generation didn't know how to plan for their future better." There it was, the first direct strike, disguised as concern, implying that Susan was a burden, financially insecure, a cautionary tale of poor planning, rather than a woman who had built a business empire through intelligence and determination. "Mom gets by just fine." David's tone was defensive, weak, as if he didn't believe his own statement. Of course, of course." Victoria's smile contradicted her words. "We all do what we can with what we have, although, well, some of us have more than others." Silence descended on the table, thick and suffocating. No one defended Susan. No one said that was uncalled for. No one objected to the casual dismissal of her worth as a human being. Victoria continued eating with renewed enthusiasm, speaking between bites about her life, her accomplishments, her superior taste and judgment. Each anecdote seemed calculated to emphasize the difference between her privileged existence and what she perceived as Susan's inadequate life. "We just closed on the new condo." She directed this announcement to her parents with undisguised pride. 3 bedrooms, Parkview, 12th floor. It cost $450,000, but David and I decided it was worth the investment. Richard raised his glass. "Let's toast to that. To success, to the future." Everyone except Susan raised their glasses. The absence of a wine glass before her seemed to mock her with its symbolism. No place at the table of prosperity, no share in the celebration of achievement. "And the best part," Victoria continued, "is that we'll finally have the space we've always wanted. No interruptions, no unexpected visits, no having to worry about accommodating people who just show up unannounced." She looked directly at Susan when she said this, her gaze unflinching. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd written it on a billboard. "You are no longer welcome in our lives." David coughed uncomfortably. "Victoria, I don't think that's necessary." "Necessary what?" She interrupted him with practiced sweetness. "I'm just sharing our good news. Is there a problem with that, none?" He looked down again, retreating from potential conflict. In that moment, Susan understood with perfect clarity. Her son wasn't merely a coward. He was a willing accomplice. He had chosen his side long ago, and that side excluded her. The realization should have devastated her, but instead it brought a strange clarity, like a fog lifting to reveal a landscape both unfamiliar and inevitable. James returned to clear some empty plates, glancing at Susan with poorly concealed concern. His eyes lingered on her untouched water glass, her empty place setting, before moving efficiently around the table. "Would you like dessert?" He addressed the table with professional neutrality. "Of course," Victoria answered immediately. "Bring your best option for 4. Again 4. Not 5. 4. Susan remained in her chair like a ghost, like someone who had been erased from the equation, but who for some cruel reason still occupied physical space. The conversation flowed around her, touching on Victoria's social engagements, Richard's golf game, Eleanor's charity committee, all the trappings of lives cushioned by privilege and defined by appearances. Eleanor leaned forward, examining Susan with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. "Susan, dear, what do you do for work currently, or are you already retired?" The question was a trap, transparent in its design. If Susan claimed retirement, it would confirm their narrative of her as an elderly woman without purpose. If she described her actual work, they would likely mock her perceived menial occupation. Before she could formulate a response, Victoria answered for her. "Susan has done a little bit of everything. Cleaning, cooking, that sort of thing. Honest work. Nothing to be ashamed of course." The way she said honest work sounded like its opposite, dripping with contempt and superiority, implying profound gratitude that she herself had never needed to lower herself to such tasks. "Admirable." Richard nodded with patronizing approval. "Hard work should always be respected. Though of course we made sure Victoria had every opportunity so she wouldn't have to go through that." Susan nodded slowly but said nothing each word from their mouths. Another reason to wait, another revelation of character to catalog in her mental evidence file. She was building a case against them brick by brick, statement by statement. David finally looked directly at her, something unidentifiable flickering in his eyes. Guilt, shame. Whatever it was vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Mom," he said softly, "are you okay?" "You're very quiet. I'm perfectly fine." Susan's voice remained steady. "I'm just observing." Victoria laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Observing? How interesting." She turned to her mother. "See, I told you she was quiet." The desserts arrived, 4 plates of tiramisu garnished with edible gold flakes. Of course, even the dessert had to be ostentatious, a statement of exclusivity rather than merely something sweet to conclude the meal. While they devoured their desserts, Susan remained motionless, her water glass still untouched. Condensation had formed a small puddle around its base. She watched the droplets slide down the crystal, slow as tears she refused to shed. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Victoria wiped her mouth with her napkin and sighed contentedly. "This is definitely my favorite restaurant. The quality is unmatched. Of course it's not for everyone's budget." Another jab, another deliberate reminder of what Victoria perceived as the unbridgeable economic gulf between them. Susan wondered how many more would come before this orchestrated humiliation concluded. Richard ordered cognac. David requested whiskey, and the women ordered more wine. Susan still sat with her water, no one offering her anything else, not even the basic courtesy of a coffee. They had collectively decided she didn't deserve even minimal hospitality. "Michael," Richard addressed David, lighting a cigar the waiter had brought him. "Your wife tells us you're considering that promotion at the company. That would mean more responsibilities, right?" David nodded, straightening in his chair like a student called upon by a demanding professor. "Yes, sir. I'd be the regional manager. A raise of almost $40,000 a year. Impressive." Richard blew smoke, slowly creating a hazy barrier between himself and the rest of the table. "That's what happens when you marry well. The right connections open doors. My brother is a partner at that firm. You know a word from me, and that position is yours." There it was, laid bare, the truth behind David's professional advancement. Not his talent, not his effort, not his education that Susan had sacrificed to provide, but his marriage into the right family. Everything Susan had worked for, every sacrifice she had made so he could succeed, had been overshadowed by a convenient alliance with wealth and influence. "We are very grateful." Victoria took David's hand on the table, a possessive gesture disguised as affection. "Family is the most important thing. Knowing how to surround yourself with the right people makes all the difference." She looked at Susan when she said this, her gaze direct and unflinching. The message couldn't have been clearer. Susan was not the right person. She was the past. Victoria represented the future. Eleanor joined the conversation, her speech slightly slurred from wine. "It's fundamental to set boundaries, too, especially when there are people who can become a burden. We can't let misunderstood feelings stop us from moving forward." "Exactly." Victoria squeezed David's hand. "That's why we've decided to make some changes. Necessary changes for our well-being and for Emily's." Emily, Susan's 4-year-old granddaughter, the little girl she watched twice a week who called her Grandma Susan and made drawings for her on printer paper. Were they planning to separate her from her granddaughter as well? What kind of changes? Susan asked, breaking her extended silence. It was the first time she had spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Victoria looked startled, as if she'd forgotten Susan could speak. Well, Susan, since you're asking, we've decided it's better for Emily to spend time with people who can add value to her life. A quality education, enriching experiences, things that some people just can't offer. Susan felt the knife twist deeper. Victoria was telling her she wasn't good enough for her own granddaughter, that her love, her time, her bedtime stories were worthless compared to what Victoria's circle considered valuable. David said nothing, drinking his whiskey and avoiding Susan's gaze. His silence was a betrayal more profound than any words could have been. I understand. Susan kept her voice calm, neutral. Anything else I should know? Victoria exchanged glances with her parents. There was something else, of course. This dinner was never about reconciliation. It was a planned execution of Susan's role in their lives. Well, Victoria played with her wine glass, rotating the stem between manicured fingers. We also want to talk about expectations. David and I have built a life of a certain standard, a life that requires maintaining certain appearances. And frankly, Susan, some of your appearances have been a bit embarrassing. Embarrassing? Susan repeated the word, feeling anger begin to simmer beneath her composed exterior. Don't take it the wrong way. Eleanor interjected with the same artificial sweetness that characterized her daughter's manner. It's just that when you came to Emily's birthday party last month with that old dress and that grocery store cake, well, it made a certain impression on our guests. The old dress, the same pearl gray one she wore now, the nicest thing she owned. The grocery store cake she had worked an extra shift to afford because she knew Emily loved strawberries. And still it hadn't been enough to meet their arbitrary standards of acceptability. The guests asked who you were. Victoria continued her methodical dissection of Susan's perceived inadequacies. It was awkward having to explain you were David's mother. Some even thought you were the help. Silence descended again, heavy as a stone. Susan allowed it to stretch to become uncomfortable before responding. And what is your point? Her tone remained firm, controlled. Victoria leaned forward, her expression a strange mixture of condescension and what might have been pity if it contained any genuine emotion. My point, Susan, is that maybe it's better if you keep your distance, at least at public events, at least when important people are around. We don't want them to think that David comes from, from poverty. Susan completed the sentence for her. From a working-class family. From a mother who broke her back to give him everything. David finally spoke, his voice carrying a pleading note. Mom, don't take it like that. They're just trying to what? David, Susan interrupted, looking directly at him. Erase me. Make me disappear because I don't fit into their perfect world. He looked down, unable to meet her steady gaze. It's not that. It's just that things are different now. We have to think about our future, about Emily. You can't have a poor mother ruining your image. Susan finished his sentence again, the words falling between them like stones. Richard tapped the table gently with his signet ring. Come now. No need to be dramatic. No one is saying you should disappear, just that you be more mindful, that you understand your position in this new family dynamic. My position? The word echoed in Susan's mind. My position. As if she were an employee who needed to remember her rank, a movable piece on a board they controlled. Victoria settled back in her chair, satisfied with the conversation's direction. Besides, Susan, let's be honest, what can you really offer this family? David is already established. We can give Emily everything she needs. You just don't have the resources or the status or the connections. I only have love. Susan's voice was quiet but firm. Victoria laughed a short, almost cruel sound. Love doesn't pay for private universities. Love doesn't open doors in society. Love doesn't get you a seat at the right table. The irony didn't escape Susan. At that moment, she literally had a seat at their table, but no place. No plate. No voice. Only a glass of water and an infinite supply of humiliation being served as if it were part of the menu. James approached again, this time with the check in a leather folder. He placed it discreetly near David, who opened it, checked the total, and produced his credit card without hesitation. $780. David muttered half to himself. Reasonable for 5 people. 5 people. They had included her place in the bill even though she hadn't eaten anything. They had paid for her humiliation, for her empty chair, for her silence. David signed the receipt and returned his card to his wallet. Victoria touched up her lipstick using a small mirror from her designer handbag. Her parents chatted about a European trip they were planning for the following month. For them, this had been a normal dinner, an everyday occurrence, not the systematic dismantling of a human being's dignity. Well, Victoria stood smoothing her dress with practiced precision. I think it's time to go. We have a busy day tomorrow. The meeting with the interior decorator is at 9. Everyone began to rise. David helped his mother-in-law with her coat. Richard left a generous tip, $40 in cash, as if to demonstrate his magnanimity extended even to service staff. Susan remained seated, something in her refusing to stand just yet, as if rising would signify acceptance of everything that had transpired, validation of their behavior. Mom, David glanced at her with poorly disguised impatience. Let's go. We have to drop Victoria's parents at their house. In a moment. Susan's voice remained calm, collected. I need to use the restroom first. Victoria rolled her eyes. Seriously, take your purse then. We'll meet you outside. Their eagerness to be rid of her was palpable, as if her presence contaminated their aura of success, as if the longer she spent with them, the greater the risk someone important might see them together. Susan stood slowly, picked up her simple cloth purse, and walked toward the restrooms. She felt their stares following her, probably thinking her pathetic, an old, humiliated, defeated woman escaping to the bathroom to cry in private. But Susan didn't go to the bathroom. She walked down the long hallway that led to the kitchen, a route she knew intimately, having traversed it hundreds of times over the past 10 years. Ever since she bought this place. Yes, this restaurant was hers. Every table, every crystal chandelier, every painting on the walls hers. The business she had built from scratch after years of hard work, meticulous savings, and smart investments. The restaurant that had made her a successful entrepreneur, though no one in her family knew it because she had decided to keep it a secret. David knew she worked in restaurants, but he always assumed it was as a waitress or line cook. She never told him the truth. She never told him about her ownership of 3 establishments in the city, including this one the most exclusive. She never mentioned her bank account with over $2 million. She never referred to the properties she owned in 2 different states. Why? Because she wanted to see who her son really was, who he would become without the influence of her money. And tonight she had finally received her answer. Susan pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The heat hit her immediately, along with the sounds of pans sizzling knives against cutting boards, orders being called in multiple languages. Her kitchen, her kingdom. Antonio Moretti, her executive chef and general manager, noticed her enter. His face brightened with recognition. A tall man in his 50s with slicked-back dark hair and an immaculate white apron. He had worked with Susan since she opened the restaurant. Mrs. Lambert. He approached quickly, speaking quietly so the busy staff wouldn't overhear. I saw you at table 22. I was going to come over and say hello, but I noticed something wasn't right. Susan smiled a small but genuine expression the first of the evening. Antonio, everything is perfectly fine. Better than you can imagine. He looked confused, glancing back toward the dining room. But I saw you sitting there with no food, just water. And those people with you, family, my son and his wife. Susan's voice remained steady. And tonight they've given me the most valuable gift they possibly could. What gift, ma'am? Clarity. Antonio didn't understand, but he nodded respectfully. In 10 years, he had never questioned Susan's decisions, and he wasn't about to start now. What do you need me to do? He asked, recognizing the purposeful look in his employer's eyes. In a few minutes, I'm going to return to that table, and when I do, I want you to come out of the kitchen. I want you to walk up to me in front of all of them, and I want you to call me what you always call me. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Mrs. Lambert. Exactly. A smile spread across Antonio's face. He had met David once years ago when Susan's son came to visit her, at work. The encounter had been brief and awkward, with David looking around the restaurant with poorly disguised disdain as if it were embarrassing that his mother worked there. He never returned. It will be my pleasure. Antonio's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Susan left the kitchen and walked back toward the dining room. Table 22 was already empty, being cleared by James for the next reservation. All evidence of what had happened was being erased, but not from Susan's memory. Never from her memory. She looked around her restaurant, the soft lighting, elegant customers enjoying their dinners, the murmur of polite conversations, piano music playing from hidden speakers. She had built all of this with her hands, her mind, her determination. And tonight, finally, she would claim her place. Susan walked out of the restaurant through the main entrance, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the kitchen's heat. David, Victoria, and her parents stood beside a luxury SUV, the valet holding the door open. They spotted her emergence, and David raised his hand in a perfunctory wave. This was merely the beginning. Susan Lambert had spent a lifetime observing, learning, and building in silence. Now, with the clarity only profound disrespect could provide, she was ready to reveal the truth about who she really was. Not just a mother, not just a grandmother, but a woman of substance and achievement who had earned everything she possessed through intelligence and perseverance. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Susan found herself strangely calm, perfectly prepared for what would come next. After all, she knew her place, not the place they had assigned her, but the place she had created for herself. "Well, Mom, thanks for coming. It was educational." David's voice carried across the sidewalk as Susan approached his tone, suggesting the evening had concluded to his satisfaction. "Very educational." Victoria nodded, that fake smile plastered across her perfectly made-up face. "I hope you understood everything we talked about tonight, that you've understood your position." "Oh, I understood it perfectly." Susan remained eerily calm, her voice carrying a new undertone of steel beneath its softness. "The question is, do you understand yours?" Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together. "Excuse me? Nothing." Susan smiled slightly, a mysterious curve of lips that revealed nothing while promising everything. "Just thinking out loud." Richard opened the car door with an impatient gesture. "Well, it's been interesting to finally meet you, Helen. Michael talks about you very little, but now I understand why." That final dismissal crystallized something in Susan's mind. Not anger, not hurt, but absolute certainty that what she was about to do was not merely justified, but necessary. "Before you go, there's something I forgot to mention." Susan's voice halted their movements toward the vehicle. David sighed, checking his watch. "Mom, it's late. It can wait." "No, it can't wait." Susan's tone brooked no argument. "In fact, I think this is the perfect time. Let's go back inside for a moment." Victoria exhaled sharply, her designer handbag swinging as she turned. "Seriously, now you're going to make a scene, not a scene." Susan was already walking back toward Bellevue's entrance, her steps measured and confident. "Just a clarification. I'll wait for you inside." She didn't look back to see if they followed. Their curiosity would bring them human nature, guaranteed it. Behind her, she heard the murmurs of confusion, the click of Victoria's heels on pavement, David's hurried explanation to his in-laws that this wouldn't take long. Susan re-entered the restaurant, nodding to the hostess, who immediately recognized the owner despite her instructions to maintain the charade. Table 22 had been reset with fresh linen, sparkling crystal and polished silver, awaiting the next reservation. Susan positioned herself beside it, waiting for her audience to arrive. David was first through the door, his face a study in contained embarrassment. "Mom, what are you doing? You're embarrassing us." "Embarrassing you?" Susan's voice remained soft, a stark contrast to the hurricane building within. "How interesting that you use those words. Tell me, David, how do you think I felt for the last 2 hours?" David opened his mouth to respond, but Victoria cut him off, inserting herself between them like a blade. "Look, Susan, I don't know what you're trying to do, but we've had enough drama for one night. If you want to play the victim, do it some other time and some other place." Richard and Eleanor had approached as well, their expressions mixing confusion with thinly veiled irritation. Richard checked his watch ostentatiously, the gold Rolex catching the light. "We really have to go. We have important engagements tomorrow. This won't take long." Susan maintained her position immovable as a lighthouse against crashing waves. "I just want to make sure we all understood what happened here tonight." "What happened?" Victoria's voice dripped with exasperation, her hands cutting through the air in sharp, dismissive gestures. "Was a family dinner where necessary boundaries were set. Boundaries that frankly should have been set a long time ago. Boundaries." Susan savored the word, letting it linger in the air between them. "How interesting. Like the boundary of not giving me food because I'm not valuable enough to share the table." David's face flushed the red creeping from his collar to his hairline. "Mom, I already explained that." "You explained nothing," Susan interrupted him, her voice carrying an edge for the first time that evening. "You sat me at a table, gave me water, and let me watch all of you eat lobster while you told me I don't deserve a place in this family." "You're exaggerating," Victoria muttered, crossing her arms defensively. Exaggerating, Susan's gaze locked onto her daughter-in-law, unwavering as a sniper's sight. "Tell me, Victoria, what do you call it when you invite someone to dinner and deprive them of food? What do you call it when you deliberately humiliate someone in front of others?" What do you call it when you tell a grandmother she isn't good enough to see her own granddaughter? The silence that followed hung thick in the air. Several diners at nearby tables had begun to notice the confrontation, their conversations dimming to observe the unfolding drama. James, who had served them earlier, hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to intervene. Eleanor stepped forward, her jewelry jangling with the movement. "Look, dear, I understand your feelings are hurt, but sometimes the truth hurts. And the truth is, David has surpassed his origins. He has built something better, and that requires leaving certain attachments behind." Attachments. Susan repeated the word, feeling how each syllable became another brick in the wall she was building between them. "That's what you call a mother who sacrificed everything for her son. A sacrifice nobody asked you for." Victoria snapped suddenly, her carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal the anger beneath. "Nobody forced you to be a single mother. Nobody forced you to work mediocre jobs. Those were your decisions. And frankly, you can't expect David to carry your poverty forever." There it was, the unvarnished truth, without pretense, raw and cruel in its honesty. David said nothing, staring at the floor like a scolded child waiting for a storm to pass. "I understand." Susan nodded slowly, her calm more unnerving than any emotional outburst would have been. "So let me ask you something. How do you like this restaurant?" The question took them by surprise, a conversational swerve they hadn't anticipated. Victoria frowned, her perfectly sculpted features contorting in confusion. "What, the restaurant?" Susan repeated, making a sweeping gesture with her hand. "Did you like it? Did you find it high quality? Exclusive enough for you?" Victoria exchanged a puzzled glance with David. "It's excellent. You know that. It's one of the best in the city. Why are you asking?" "Just curious." Susan's smile remained enigmatic. "Because earlier you said I had only worked mediocre jobs, cleaning, cooking, that sort of thing. And you're right. I worked cleaning houses for years. I worked in kitchens for even more years." "What are you getting at?" Richard asked, his patience clearly evaporating. "I'm getting to the fact that I did indeed work in kitchens." Susan continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Including the kitchen of this restaurant. In fact, I spent many hours in that kitchen developing the menu, training the staff, making sure every dish that went out was perfect." David looked up, confusion replacing the embarrassment on his face. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about my work, David. My mediocre job, as Victoria called it. I'm talking about the long hours I spent building something from scratch. Something that is apparently good enough for you." Victoria let out a nervous laugh, the sound brittle as thin ice. "Susan, I don't think you understand. This restaurant is owned by Waite." Her face changed as realization began to dawn. "You work here. You're a cook here. I worked here," Susan corrected, watching Victoria's expression carefully. "But not as a cook." At that precise moment, as if perfectly choreographed, Antonio emerged from the kitchen. He wore his immaculate chef's uniform, his posture straight as a ruler, his expression professional, but with an unmistakable glint of satisfaction in his dark eyes. He walked directly toward their group, every eye in the restaurant following his deliberate progress across the dining room. The murmur of conversations dimmed, sensing something momentous was unfolding. Antonio stopped before Susan with a slight bow that managed to be both respectful and slightly theatrical. "Mrs. Lambert, pardon the interruption. There's a matter in the office that requires your attention. Could you please review it before you leave for the night?" The silence that followed was absolute. David blinked rapidly, his mind visibly struggling to process what he had just heard. Mrs. Lambert. Antonio glanced at him briefly before returning his attention to Susan. "Yes, Mrs. Lambert, the owner of this establishment." Victoria's jaw dropped, literally fell open, her eyes widening to the size of the dessert plates they'd been served earlier. "What owner?" "The person who signs my paycheck every month." Antonio's voice carried the careful precision of someone explaining something very simple to a child. "The person who built this place 10 years ago and turned it into what it is today." Richard took an involuntary step backward, as if physically struck by this revelation. His wife clutched at her triple strand of pearls. David stared at Susan as if seeing her for the first time, his perception undergoing a seismic shift. "Mom, you—" The words escaped him in a hoarse whisper. "Yes," Susan stated simply. "Me, the woman who apparently has no resources. The woman who has no status. The woman who embarrasses her family with her old dresses and her grocery store cakes. That woman owns the restaurant where you all just spent $780 to humiliate me. Victoria attempted to speak, her mouth opening and closing several times without producing sound. Impossible. She finally managed the word emerging strangled and weak. This is how Susan's voice remained steady, unimpressed by their shock. With those mediocre jobs you despise so much, with every dollar I saved for years, with smart investments, with hard work, with sacrifice, everything that apparently means nothing to you. Antonio remained at Susan's side, a silent guardian bearing witness. Behind him, several kitchen staff had emerged to watch from a discreet distance, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and protective concern for their employer. The diners at nearby tables had abandoned any pretense of disinterest, openly watching the confrontation unfold like a live theater performance playing out between the appetizer and main course. "But you said you worked in restaurants." David stammered, his worldview crumbling around him. "You said you waited tables that you cooked." "And I did," Susan confirmed with a nod. "I did all of that while I was building my business, while I was learning every aspect of this industry, while I was investing every penny I earned into growing something worthwhile, something that ironically you consider good enough for your standards." Richard found his voice attempting to reassert control over a situation rapidly spinning beyond his influence. "If you're so successful, why did you never say so? Why keep it a secret? Because I wanted to know who my son really was without the influence of my money." Susan's gaze pierced him like a blade. "I wanted to see if he would love me for who I am, not for what I have. And tonight I got my answer." David turned pale, his complexion ashen beneath the restaurant's warm lighting. "Mom, I didn't know." "You didn't know," Susan interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of decades of disappointment. "And without knowing, you treated me like trash. You sat me at this table, denied me food, humiliated me in front of your in-laws, and told me I should know my place." Victoria finally regained her powers of speech, though her voice trembled noticeably. Wait. This doesn't make sense. If you have so much money, why do you live in that tiny apartment? Why do you wear simple clothes? Why did you bring a grocery store cake to Emily's birthday? Because money doesn't define who I am," Susan answered calmly, her voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "I live modestly because I choose to. I wear simple clothes because I'm comfortable that way. And I bought that cake because my granddaughter loves strawberries, and that cake had the freshest strawberries I could find. I don't need to prove my worth to anyone with designer labels or luxury cars." "But you could have told us." David insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "You could have told us you had all this." For what Susan allowed the question to hang in the air for a moment, heavy with implication. "So you would treat me well? So you would respect me?" "Respect isn't bought, David. It's earned, or it should be earned, simply by virtue of me being your mother." Antonio cleared his throat discreetly. "Mrs. Lambert, would you like me to call security if these people are making you uncomfortable?" "That won't be necessary, Antonio." Susan touched his arm briefly, the gesture conveying both gratitude and authority. "They're my family, or at least they were." Those last words fell like a hammer, their impact visible on David's face. Tears began to form in his eyes, turning the restaurant lights into fractured stars. "Mom, please." He took a hesitant step toward her, his hand half extended. We didn't know. If we had known, if you had known what..." Susan cut him off mercilessly. "You would have treated me differently. You would have served me lobster instead of water. You would have spoken to me with respect instead of contempt." "That is exactly why I never told you. Because a son's love for his mother shouldn't depend on her bank account." Victoria had gone pale, but Susan noticed something calculating in her expression, the wheels visibly turning as she reassessed the situation and her position within it. The predator, suddenly recognizing it, had misjudged its prey. "Susan!" Victoria's voice had completely transformed, the contempt replaced by a honeyed tone Susan recognized as dangerous. "I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding. We never wanted no." Susan cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't do that. Don't try to rewrite what happened just 20 minutes ago. You said exactly what you meant to say. You did exactly what you meant to do. And now you have to live with the consequences." Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as if it had suddenly tightened. "Well, this is certainly unexpected. Marlene, dear, perhaps we should discuss this in private. As a family." "As a family," Susan repeated, unable to suppress a bitter laugh. "Half an hour ago you told me I wasn't family, that I was a burden, that I was an embarrassment, that I should keep my distance. Eleanor attempted to intervene, her voice dripping with synthetic sweetness. Susan, dear, we all say things when we're tired or stressed. Surely you can forgive a little— A little what? Susan interrupted. A little mistake. A little humiliation. You left me without food at a family dinner. You treated me as if I were invisible. You told me I wasn't good enough for my own granddaughter. That is not a little mistake. It's a revelation of character. The entire restaurant seemed suspended in time, every patron and staff member witnessing a drama more compelling than anything they had paid to see on a stage. This moment had transcended the personal, becoming a public reckoning that resonated with anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. David took another step toward Susan, tears now streaming openly down his face. Mom, please. You're right. Everything you said is true. I was a coward. I was cruel. I let Victoria treat you like that, and I did nothing to stop her. But I can change. We can fix this. You can change, Susan asked softly, her voice carrying in the hushed restaurant. David, you're 32 years old. You're not a child. You're a grown man who deliberately chose to humiliate his own mother to impress his wife and in-laws. That's not something you fix with an apology. Then what do you want? The question escaped him in a desperate plea. Tell me what I have to do to fix this. Susan looked at her son, at the man she had raised with so much love and sacrifice. In his face, she saw echoes of the 5-year-old boy who had cried in her arms after his father left the proud teenager on his college acceptance day, the nervous young man at his wedding, and now the adult who had betrayed her in the most profound way possible. I don't know if you can fix this. Her honesty cut deeper than any accusation could have. I don't know if I want you to fix it. Victoria, recovering some of her composure, tried a different approach. Look, Susan, obviously there was a lack of communication. If you had just told us from the beginning that you had resources, none of this would have happened. Exactly. Susan pointed at her, the gesture sharp as an accusation. None of this would have happened if you'd known I have money, but it did happen because you thought I didn't. And that tells you everything you need to know about yourself. Victoria's face flushed with anger, her careful mask slipping entirely. You can't just show up and show up, Susan interrupted, her voice rising slightly for the first time that evening. This is my restaurant, Victoria. You are the one who showed up here. You are the one who sat at my table, ate my food, and used my establishment as a stage to humiliate me. And now you have the nerve to tell me I'm the one who's out of line. Antonio stepped forward, professional concern tempering his evident enjoyment of the situation. Mrs. Lambert, if I may suggest, perhaps it would be better to continue this conversation in your office. The customers are starting to get concerned. Susan glanced around, suddenly aware of their audience. Antonio was right. While some diners appeared fascinated by the unfolding drama, others looked uncomfortable, their expensive evening disrupted by this unexpected emotional display. You're right, Antonio. Susan nodded, recognizing her responsibility to her business despite her personal turmoil. But there will be no conversation in my office. Everything that needed to be said has been said. She turned back to David, who stood defeated, shoulders slumped like Atlas finally surrendering his burden. I'm going to tell you something, son, and I want you to listen closely because it will probably be the last thing I say to you for a long time. The money I have, the businesses I built, the properties I own, I did it all thinking about your future, thinking about leaving you something when I'm gone, thinking about making sure your daughter, my granddaughter, would have opportunities. David was sobbing openly now, years of carefully constructed identity collapsing around him. Mom, but tonight you taught me something valuable, Susan continued relentlessly. You taught me that giving money to someone who doesn't respect you isn't generosity, it's weakness. You taught me that the real legacy isn't what you leave in a bank account, but the values you instill. And clearly I failed at that. You didn't fail. His words emerged broken through his tears. I failed. I ruined everything. Yes, you did. Susan confirmed the words, falling like knives between them. And do you know what the worst part is, David? It's not that you treated me poorly tonight. It's that you probably would have kept doing it if you hadn't found out I have money. That's the part that hurts the most. Victoria attempted to approach her previous arrogance, replaced by calculation barely disguised as contrition. Susan, I understand you're angry, but let's be reasonable. We're family. We can get past this. Family, Susan repeated, regarding her coldly. Family doesn't humiliate. Family doesn't despise. Family doesn't leave you with a glass of water while everyone else eats in front of you. You don't know what family means, Victoria. And sadly, my son seems to have forgotten too. Richard, who had remained relatively quiet during this exchange, finally spoke in a tone that attempted to reclaim his authority. "Look, ma'am, I understand you feel offended, but you're making an unnecessary scene. We are respectable people. We don't deserve to be publicly humiliated this way." Susan turned to him slowly, something in her expression causing him to take an involuntary step backward. "Publicly humiliated." She repeated the phrase, her voice dangerously calm. "Interesting choice of words. Tell me, what exactly did you all do to me half an hour ago? What would you call leaving someone without food at a family dinner? Telling her she needs to know her place, implying she's too poor and embarrassing to be around her own family." He didn't answer, jaw clenched tightly, gaze sliding away from her unflinching stare. "That's what I thought." Susan nodded. "The humiliation only counts when it happens to you, right? When I suffer it, it's just setting necessary boundaries, right?" Eleanor touched her husband's arm nervously. "Honey, maybe we should go. This is clearly not going anywhere." "Oh no." Susan held up her hand. "Not yet, because there's something else I need to say, and you're all going to hear it." Antonio remained beside her, his presence silent but supportive. Behind him, several staff members had moved closer, forming a discreet semicircle that reflected their loyalty to the woman who had employed them for years. "Victoria," Susan fixed her daughter-in-law with an unblinking gaze. "You said I couldn't offer anything of value to this family, that I had no resources, status, or connections. Let me correct you on that." Victoria stared back with a mixture of resentment and apprehension, her previous confidence shattered by this unexpected reversal of fortune. "I own 3 restaurants in this city." Susan's voice remained measured but carried throughout the now silent dining room. "This is the most exclusive, but the other 2 are also very successful. I own commercial properties in 2 different states. I have investments in technology, real estate, and international markets. My net worth is over $2 million. And I built it all with those mediocre jobs you despise so much." The silence that followed was absolute, the sound of a collective breath held of mental recalculations occurring simultaneously across multiple minds. As for connections, Susan continued, allowing herself a gesture that encompassed the restaurant. "Look around this room. See that man in the corner booth? He's the mayor of this city. He dines here twice a month. The woman by the window, she's a superior court judge. The group at the large table are executives from the biggest corporation in the state. All of them know me. All of them respect me. Not because I have money, but because I built something valuable, and I did it with integrity." David had collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. His world had not merely shifted, but shattered, the pieces impossible to reassemble into their former configuration. "But do you know what's the most ironic part of all this?" Victoria Susan leaned slightly toward her, voice lowered but still perfectly audible in the hushed restaurant. "That promotion David is waiting for, the one your uncle is supposedly going to secure for him, I could make one phone call and guarantee it in 5 minutes. The CEO of that company dines here every Friday. I've known him for 6 years, but I never did it because I believed David should earn things for himself, just like I did." Victoria appeared physically destabilized by this revelation, one hand gripping the back of a nearby chair for balance, her carefully applied makeup unable to conceal her pallor. "And as for status," Susan addressed all of them, her voice rising slightly, "let me explain something to you about real status. It's not about how much money you have or what clothes you wear or what car you drive. It's about how you treat people when you think they can offer you nothing in return. It's about integrity, compassion, and respect. And by that measure, all of you are absolutely penniless." Eleanor made a choked sound, one hand flying to her throat as if physically struck by Susan's words. "Tonight you tested my character." Susan's voice softened, though its intensity remained undiminished. "You humiliated me to see what I would do, if I would cry, if I would beg, if I would leave in silence. But what you didn't expect was this. You didn't expect me to have power, and now that you know I have it, you want to take it all back. You want to pretend nothing happened. You want us to be family again." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, watching understanding dawn on their faces. "But family doesn't work that way," Susan continued relentlessly. "You can't turn it on and off like a switch to suit your convenience. You can't mistreat someone and then expect everything to return to normal when you discover that person has something you want." David lifted his head, his face ravaged by tears. "Mom, please. I'll do anything. Anything. Give me a chance to prove I can change." Susan regarded her son, this broken man, before her, and felt something complicated unfurl in her chest. Love mixed with disappointment, maternal instinct, warring with self-preservation, the woman who had given everything, fighting against the woman who now understood her own worth. David, her voice gentled slightly, the problem isn't whether you can change. The problem is that you shouldn't need a dramatic revelation to treat your own mother well. The problem is that your respect for me was dependent on what you thought I could or couldn't offer you. I was blind, he choked out through continuing sobs. Victoria had me blind, but that's no excuse. I should have been stronger. I should have defended you. Victoria took a step back, outraged by this betrayal. Now you're blaming me. You agreed with everything. You said those things too. Why do I follow you blindly in everything? David suddenly shouted, turning on her with unexpected fury. Because I always want to please you, to keep the peace, to avoid your tantrums. But look what it cost me. Look what I did by trying to make someone happy who doesn't even know what respect means. Victoria recoiled as if David had physically struck her, incredulity washing over her features. How dare you? After everything I've done for you. How dare I? David's voice rose, years of suppressed resentment finally breaking through. You organized this dinner. You insisted on inviting Mom, and now I know why. You wanted to humiliate her. You wanted to put her in her place, like you said. This was planned from the beginning. Victoria's face flushed crimson, her composure crumbling entirely. I did not. That's not. It's exactly that. Susan interjected calmly, the eye of the hurricane, while chaos swirled around her. This was never a reconciliation dinner. It was an execution. A way to make it clear to me that I'm no longer welcome in your lives. That my place is outside in the dark, where I can't embarrass you. Antonio cleared his throat, professional courtesy warring with evident satisfaction. Mrs. Lambert, there are clients waiting for this table. Would you like me to escort them to the exit? Victoria glared at him, indignation momentarily overriding her shock. You can't kick us out. We were paying customers. Actually, Antonio's smile could have frozen champagne. The check was processed half an hour ago. You are no longer customers. You are people who are disturbing the atmosphere of this establishment, and Mrs. Lambert has every right to ask you to leave. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to reassert his authority through sheer physical presence. This is ridiculous. We're going to sue for what? Susan crossed her arms, unintimidated by his bluster. For treating my staff well, for owning my own business, for defending myself from humiliation. I suggest you think very carefully before you threaten legal action. I have very good lawyers, and I have proof of every word you said tonight. Susan gestured toward the discreet black domes recessed into the ceiling. This restaurant has security cameras in every corner, audio and video. The color drained from Richard's face, his legal threats evaporating like morning mist. Victoria turned even paler, if that was possible, her mind visibly racing through the implications of her recorded behavior. Don't worry. Susan's voice remained measured, controlled. I have no intention of using that material against you unless you force me to, unless you try to slander me or cause me problems. Then yes, those recordings will become very public. And let me tell you, social media is not kind to people who humiliate elderly mothers in public. You're not elderly, David muttered miserably, a weak attempt to find some flaw in her statement. To them I was. Susan motioned toward Victoria's parents. To them, I was the poor old lady who didn't even deserve a plate of food. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it trembled noticeably. We never wanted it to go this far. We thought we were protecting our daughter, our granddaughter. Protecting them from what? The question hung in the air, sharp as a scalpel. From a grandmother who loves them. From a woman who only wanted to be part of their lives. You weren't protecting anyone. You were feeding your own sense of superiority. Victoria, seeing that all was lost, tried one final approach. Her voice softened, almost pleading. Susan, I know things got out of control tonight, but think about Emily. Think about your granddaughter. Do you really want to keep her away from you because of this? It was precisely the wrong tactic. Susan's expression hardened, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do I want to keep her away from me? Victoria, you were the one who said Emily needed to spend time with people who could add value, that I wasn't good enough for her, that my experiences weren't enriching. I'm not the one who pushed her away. You are. Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Susan continued, relentlessly cutting through any attempted defense. And now that you know I have money, now that you know I have connections and resources, suddenly you want me to think about my granddaughter? Suddenly I'm good enough to be in her life. It doesn't work that way. My relationship with Emily is not a commodity you can negotiate based on your convenience. She loves you. David's desperate plea cut through the tension. She asks about you all the time. She makes drawings for you. She misses you. Susan felt a piercing ache in her heart. Emily, her sweet 4-year-old granddaughter with those dark curls and infectious laugh. The child who called her Grandma Susan and fell asleep in her arms while she read stories. Walking away from Emily would be like tearing out a piece of her own soul. But staying, allowing this toxic dynamic to continue, would teach Emily that abuse was acceptable, that unconditional love meant accepting humiliation. That was a lesson Susan refused to impart. I miss her too. Susan's voice softened momentarily, revealing the depth of her pain. I miss her every day. But I will not allow her to grow up in an environment where she's taught that it's okay to mistreat people based on their apparent social status. I will not let her learn from her mother that cruelty is acceptable if the victim seems defenseless. Please. David moved closer, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. Don't punish all of us for my mistakes. Emily is innocent in all of this. I know. Susan's voice remained gentle but firm. And that's precisely why I can't allow her to be exposed to this kind of behavior any longer. If you want me to be part of her life again, you are going to have to prove to me that you have changed. And I don't mean changed because you now know I have money. I mean a real profound change in how you treat people. Antonio discreetly cleared his throat. Mrs. Lambert, we really need to clear this area. There's a 10 o'clock reservation, and it's almost 5 minutes to 10. Susan nodded, grateful for the interruption. This confrontation had drained every ounce of energy she possessed, leaving her simultaneously empty and somehow more substantial than she'd been hours earlier. You're right. She looked at each of them in turn, David, Victoria, Richard, Eleanor, committing their expressions to memory. It's time for you to go. All of you. And then what David asked, his voice broken barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. You just erase us from your life after everything, no. Susan's reply carried the weight of finality. You erased me from yours tonight. I'm just respecting your decision. But we said terrible things because we didn't know Victoria insisted panic infusing her words. If we had known the truth, that is exactly the problem. Susan interrupted. That your behavior depends on what you think someone can offer you. That's not respect. That's opportunism. Richard stepped forward, attempting to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of the evening. Look, obviously we all made mistakes tonight, but we're reasonable people. We can reach an agreement. An agreement? Susan almost laughed at the audacity. What kind of agreement are you proposing? We pretend nothing happened in exchange for what? Access to my money, my connections, my resources. That's not it. He replied quickly, though his expression betrayed him. It was exactly that, a calculation of potential benefit against the cost of humbling himself. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Susan straightened her shoulders, authority radiating from her like heat from a flame. I'm going to give you time. Time to think about what you did. Time to reflect on what kind of people you want to be. And time to decide if you truly value people for who they are, or only for what you can get from them. How much time? David asked, anxiously clinging to this small thread of hope. As long as it takes. Susan's expression remained impassive. It could be a month. It could be 6 months. It could be never. It's entirely up to you. Victoria made a sound of frustration, her hands clenching at her sides. That's not fair. You can't just leave us hanging like this. Not fair. Susan's voice rose slightly for the first time that evening, the controlled facade cracking just enough to reveal the molten core beneath. You know what's not fair, Victoria. It's not fair to invite someone to dinner and deny them food. It's not fair to deliberately humiliate your mother-in-law in front of your family. It's not fair to tell a grandmother she isn't good enough for her own granddaughter. That is what's not fair. Victoria shrank back at the controlled intensity in Susan's voice, momentarily speechless. Now, Susan gestured toward the exit, her motion encompassing all 4 of them. It's time for you to go. Antonio will escort you to the door. Antonio stepped forward, his manner professional, but with an unmistakable firmness that brooked no argument. This way, please. David made one final desperate attempt. Mom, please. I love you. I've always loved you. I made a terrible, unforgivable mistake, but you have to believe me when I say I'm sorry. Susan looked at him, this man who had been her entire world for more than 3 decades. She saw the tears streaking his face, the desperation in his eyes. Part of her, that maternal core that never truly died, wanted to comfort him, to hold him, and tell him everything would be all right. But another part, the part that had been trampled tonight, the part that deserved dignity and respect, held firm against the tide of maternal instinct. Love without respect isn't love. The words fell between them like stones into still water ripples of truth expanding outward. It's dependence. It's manipulation. It's convenience. And I have spent my whole life confusing one for the other. But tonight you taught me the difference. I can learn. David insisted, his voice breaking. I can be better. Give me a chance. I already gave you every chance in the world. Susan's truth cut deeper than any accusation could have. I gave you my youth. I gave you my money. I gave you my time. I gave you my unconditional love. And you chose to use me as a stepping stone and then kick me away when you thought you didn't need me anymore. The words were harsh, but they needed to be said. Years of unspoken truth finally finding voice cleansing like antiseptic on a wound painful but necessary for healing. Eleanor grabbed Victoria's arm, suddenly eager to escape the emotional maelstrom they had helped create. Let's go, dear. We've caused enough of a scandal for one night. But Mom said we can fix this. Victoria protested weakly, her usual confidence shattered. Not tonight. Eleanor pulled her daughter toward the exit. Definitely not tonight. Richard followed his wife and daughter without further comment, though he shot Susan a parting glance that mixed resentment with reluctant respect. The Thompson family pride had suffered a blow from which it might never fully recover. David was the last to move, dragging his feet like a child forced to leave a playground. He stopped at the restaurant entrance and turned back one final time. Can I at least call you, send messages, anything? Susan considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted to say yes to keep that line of communication open, but she recognized the pattern that would inevitably follow. He would apologize, she would forgive, and nothing would fundamentally change. When you're ready to have a real conversation, her voice softened slightly, acknowledging the pain they both felt. When you're ready to make real changes, not just say what you think I want to hear, then you can contact me, but not before. How will I know when I'm ready? The question emerged, raw, unfiltered, revealing David's genuine confusion. You'll know. Susan's answer carried the weight of certainty. When you can look at what happened tonight and fully understand without excuses or justifications the depth of the damage you caused. When you can recognize that the problem wasn't that you didn't know I had money, but that you believed it was acceptable to treat me that way in the first place. When you get to that point of understanding, then you'll be ready. He nodded slowly, tears continuing to stream down his face. I love you, Mom. I love you too. The admission came easily because it remained true despite everything. That's why this hurts so much. That's why I need this to mean something. That's why I can't just forgive and forget as if nothing happened. Antonio gently touched David's shoulder, a reminder that the conversation had reached its conclusion. Sir, please. I need to ask you to leave now. David nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. He walked toward the door, shoulders slumped in defeat, the picture of a man facing the consequences of his actions for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Susan watched them all leave one by one until they disappeared into the night. For a moment, the restaurant seemed suspended in time, a collective breath held, then slowly released. Then, as if someone had pressed play after a pause, conversations resumed. Silverware clinked against plates. Life continued its inexorable forward motion. Antonio approached, concern evident in his expression. Mrs. Lambert, are you all right? Do you need to sit down? A glass of water, though? I suppose you've had enough water for one night. Despite everything, Susan laughed, a small, tired but genuine laugh that surprised even her. I'm fine, Antonio. Or at least I will be eventually. He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. What you did tonight was brave. Difficult, but brave. And if I may say so, absolutely necessary. Do you think I was too harsh? The question escaped before she could stop it. After everything that had transpired, some part of her still sought validation, still questioned whether she had done the right thing. Antonio shook his head firmly. Mrs. Lambert, I've worked for you for 10 years. I've watched you build this empire from scratch. I've seen you treat every employee with dignity, pay fair wages when you could have paid less, give chances to people other businesses would turn away. You are one of the most generous, kind-hearted people I know. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But I've also seen you sacrifice too much. Work double shifts so you could send money to your son. Deny yourself pay raises to keep prices affordable. Live modestly while building wealth you never enjoyed. And I always wondered why. Tonight I finally understood you were testing something. And sadly you got your answer. His assessment resonated with a truth Susan hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. The test had been ongoing for years, and tonight had brought the definitive result. I wasn't harsh. Susan finished the thought he had left unspoken. I was fair. There's a difference. Exactly. Antonio agreed, relief evident in his expression. And if I may offer some personal advice, I think you need to go home, have a glass of wine, and rest. Tonight was intense. Susan looked around the restaurant. Tables were filled again. Conversations had returned to their normal rhythm. It was as if the last 30 minutes had been a parenthesis in reality, a suspended moment that had now closed. But for her, nothing would ever be the same. You're right. The exhaustion suddenly hit her, a physical wave that made her realize how much emotional energy she had expended. I'm going home. You'll handle closing tonight. Of course, ma'am. As always. Susan walked to her office at the back of the restaurant, a small but cozy space with an old desk shelves filled with cookbooks and recipes and photographs on the walls. Photos of the restaurant's opening, of special events, of her team. And yes, there were some of David too. David graduating from college, David at his wedding, David holding a newborn Emily. She picked up one of the photographs, the one from his graduation. His smile was enormous proud. She stood beside him, her hands on his shoulders. They looked happy. They looked like a real family. When had it all fractured? Was it gradual, a slow erosion of respect and connection? Were there warning signs she had ignored? Or was it sudden, a change she hadn't seen coming? Probably both imperceptible shifts accumulating until the foundation crumbled beneath the weight of pretense. Susan placed the photo back in its spot and gathered her purse. She turned off the office lights and walked out the back door, the one that led to the private parking lot where she kept her car. Nothing flashy, just a reliable 5-year-old sedan. Another expression of her choice to live modestly despite having the means for ostentation. The cold night air hit her face as she emerged from the restaurant's warmth. She took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs, somehow cleansing the emotional residue of the evening. The sky above Boston was clear stars glittering like tiny reminders that the universe extended far beyond her personal pain. She drove home in silence. No music, no radio, just the mechanical hum of the car and the rhythm of her own thoughts. Her mind drifted to David as a little boy, how he used to hug her and declare that when he grew up, he'd buy her a big house with a swimming pool. She thought about the years of sacrifice, skipped meals so he could eat well nights without sleep, so she could work extra shifts. Dreams deferred so his could flourish. And she thought about how despite all that she had ended up sitting in her own restaurant watching him eat lobster while he gave her only water and told her to know her place. Susan arrived at her apartment, the same small but comfortable space where she had lived for 15 years. 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, a living room with old but comfortable furniture. Victoria had asked why she lived like this if she had so much money. The answer was simple. This place was hers. She had earned it, and she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She made herself a cup of tea, sat on the sofa, and finally allowed the tears to come. She cried for the relationship she had lost, for the granddaughter she probably wouldn't see for a long time. She cried for the mother she had been so dedicated that she had forgotten to teach her son the most important lesson, that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars. But she also cried with relief, because after years carrying the weight of invisibility of being taken for granted, she had finally stood up for herself. She had finally said, no more. Her phone vibrated with an incoming text message from David. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Mom? I know you asked for space, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. Not for your money, not for your restaurants, but for forgetting who you were to me. For forgetting everything you did, for letting you sit there with no food while I ate as if you didn't matter. I'm going to work on myself. I'm going to be better, and someday I hope I can prove it to you. I love you. Susan read the message 3 times. The words sounded sincere, but words always seemed sincere in the heat of the moment after being caught. True change would be demonstrated over time through actions, not through panicked text messages sent in the immediate aftermath of revelation. She didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, she opened her photo gallery and looked for pictures of Emily. Her sweet granddaughter smiling in her yellow dress at her last birthday, holding the grocery store cake Susan had brought, the one that had apparently caused such embarrassment. But in the photo, Emily looked radiant, happy, loved. That was what mattered, not the price of the cake, not the brand of the dress, but the love behind the gesture. And if there was one thing tonight had taught her, it was this: love without respect wasn't enough. Sacrifice without recognition wasn't noble. It was self-destructive. And teaching people to walk all over you didn't make them better, it only made you smaller. Susan leaned back against the sofa cushions, cradling her tea, staring at the ceiling. She considered the future stretching before her, suddenly full of possibilities. What would life be like without that toxic family dynamic consuming her energy? For the first time in years, she felt something like hope. Perhaps she would use more of her money on herself. Take that trip to Italy she had always dreamed about. Sign up for those painting classes that had interested her. Maybe she'd renovate this apartment not because she needed to impress anyone, but because she deserved it. Perhaps she would invest more in her other restaurants, expand the business further, or start a foundation to help single mothers struggling just as she once had. The possibilities seemed endless, limited only by imagination rather than resources. For the first time in a long time, Susan felt as though her life belonged to her again, not defined by her role as mother or grandmother, but by her own desires and choices. Her phone vibrated again. Another message, but this time from an unknown number. She opened it curiously. "Mrs. Lambert, this is Martin Reynolds from the restaurant tonight, table 18. I witnessed what happened with your family. I just wanted to say that what you did was extraordinary. The respect you showed for yourself, the dignity with which you handled the situation was inspiring. My wife and I are regular customers, but after tonight, we are admirers. Thank you for reminding us that standing up for yourself isn't cruelty, it's self-love." Susan read the message twice, feeling something warm expand in her chest. A stranger, someone who owed her nothing, had taken the time to find her number and send words of encouragement. She replied briefly, "Thank you. Your words mean more than you can imagine." And it was true. Amidst all the pain, all the confusion, all the loss, that single small message reminded her of something vital: she had done the right thing. She had honored her own worth in a world that constantly demanded women, especially older women, to make themselves smaller for others' comfort. Susan finished her tea and went to her bedroom. She changed into comfortable clothes, washed her face, and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw a 64-year-old woman with hard-earned wrinkles, with tired but still bright eyes, with silver hair she had stopped dyeing years ago. She saw a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had built empires while others underestimated her, a woman who had finally learned that her value didn't depend on anyone else's validation or approval. "You know your place," Susan said to her reflection, recalling David's cruel words from earlier in the evening. "And your place is wherever you decide it is." She got into bed, turned off the light, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new paths to choose, new wounds to heal. But for tonight she had done enough. She had defended her dignity. She had reclaimed her power. She had shown that while some people spend their lives learning to know their place, others learn to own theirs. And Susan Lambert, after a lifetime of sacrifice and silence, had finally become the owner of hers.